Bearvold looked at the merman, who looked back at him with wide, pretty eyes. It wasn't that Bearvold was a shy person really, or even very sensitive, but he was more than aware of his tendency to make people nervous by his mere stern presence, and he didn't know how the stranger would react without the buffer of the others, or the buffer of being in terrible pain and just needing a strong support to cling to. He cleared his throat and unfolded the soft black pants Lucas had handed him. He recognized them as a pair that Emil wore whenever he was lounging around. "Want to try these on?" he asked. The merman cocked his head to the side, studying the garment closely. His eyes then flicked over Bearvold's own legs, clad in jeans, and the man could hear the blonde's brain putting the pieces together. When he figured it out, he gave a small frown and shook his head. "Why not?" The merman shrugged and rubbed at his bare knees, swinging his legs and smiling at him. "I suppose you want to look at your legs now that you have them." The merman nodded, holding his feet up off the ground and wiggling his toes, delighting in the action. "Okay, the boxers should be enough, I suppose, but if you get cold, let me know." The blonde merman shook his head again, and without blinking an eye, began tugging the sweater off. "I'm supposed to be dressing you, not the opposite." The merman shed the sweater, pulling out the length of his hair from the neck, and sighed pleasantly, running his hands lightly over his bare chest and arms. "Just more comfortable this way?" A contented nod was his response. "Oh, if you want. Okay then." They stared at each other again, until the merman held out his arms and made a small crooning sound from his throat. "Want to walk again?" Bearvold tried. The merman shook his head. "Want me to carry you?" A happy nod. "All right, but hold on to that sweater in case you get cold." The merman held the sweater balled up in his lap, even as Bearvold carefully scooped him up and carried him down the hallway. All the while, those slender legs were swinging gently over his strong arm. Now that he was alert and no longer half asleep, the merman was engaged in observing all that was around him. Bearvold could practically feel him vibrating with excitement, a small purring sound rumbling in his chest. You'd have to ask Lucas whether he thought those sounds could be residual from his merform like his gills. Not that it particularly mattered. He rather liked the sounds. Matthias and Emil were hovering over one of their laptops on a coffee table, chatting excitedly over the website. They spotted them as soon as they were at the top of the stairs overlooking the great room. Matthias scrambled to grab his ever-present camera and turn it up at them. "Look at that! Our little water prince being carried down to breakfast," he said with a chuckle. "What happened to your sweater, Bearvold?" "Took it off," Bearvold supplied. "Guess he's more comfortable without it." "Makes sense. He's never worn clothes before." "Just don't want him getting cold," Matthias pointed out as Bearvold passed by him on the way to the dining room. "That's what I said," he muttered, sitting the merman carefully in one of the dining chairs. The table was already set for breakfast, and the merman ran his fingers over the plate in front of him, studying it with round eyes. "Well, if I had a body of solid muscle like that, I wouldn't want to cover it up either," Matthias said. The merman cocked his head, then looked down at himself, running a hand over his firm midsection, and then looked up questioningly. "That was a compliment, bro. You're way toned." "Well, he's been swimming his entire life just to get around," Emil commented, leaning against the back of a dining chair across from the merman. "Have you seen swimmers' bodies?" The merman seemed more confused, and slowly lifted the sweater in his lap to cover his chest and belly, as though to hide. "It's fine," Emil told him. "There's nothing wrong with you. We're just used to everyone wearing clothes when it's cold outside." The merman looked unconvinced, still holding the garment over himself. "Great," Emil chided. "He's barely awake, and you already gave him a body complex." "I did not," Matthias insisted. "He just doesn't get what I was saying. He has a great body. You understand me, fish boy? You have a really great body." A blush broke out across the merman's white cheeks, and he couldn't hide the smile that rose on his lips. "See? He knows." "How's his hair?" Emil asked, coming to stand beside the merman. He slowly held out his hand. "Can I?" The merman nodded at him, and Emil threaded his fingers through the long mane, checking for tangles. It's not as bad as I thought, but we really do need to comb it out." The merman's eyes went wide and he jumped, literally grabbing onto the length of his hair and yanking it from Emil's hands. holding onto it tightly and shaking his head. Brush it out, Emil rephrased, holding his hands up innocently. It means to get out all the knots and tangles. I didn't mean pull it out. The merman relaxed, letting out an audible breath and releasing his hair. It fell along his back, undisturbed once more. This will be hard, Bervold intoned, in response to the little misunderstanding. He took the seat beside the merman. Maybe, called Lucas's voice from the kitchen, things would go more smoothly if we knew his name. The merman nodded at these words immediately, making a small affirmative sound. Let's get one thing straight first, Matthias said, leaning across the table with his upper body, but still getting close to the merman's face with the camera. Can you talk? When the merman looked muddled, he tried again. You know, talk, with your mouth and lips? He enunciated clearly, and made over-exaggerated movements with his lips while pointing to them. The merman touched his fingertips to his own lips, and mimicked speaking as if he thought to himself. A second later, his eyes lit up and he nodded. He seemed to think better of it, and shook his head instead. Either you can or you can't, Matthias said insistently. Which is it? Matthias, Lucas warned from the kitchen. Remember, don't overwhelm him. The merman looked worried, and then began to make gestures that no one could interpret, pointing over and over to his head, then his lips, and making little sounds while he did. All right, said Emil, after a few minutes of gawping at him. You obviously have a voice. You've made enough noise since last night for us to be sure of that. So why don't you talk to us when it's obvious you can understand what we're saying? Stilling, the merman took a deep breath, closing his eyes in concentration. He breathed again, and opened his mouth. Not used to talking like you do. A clatter came from the kitchen. Lucas's face appeared from around the hanging cabinets that cut off his view from the dining room. Matthias turned the camera to catch his wide-eyed expression. Did he just talk? Yeah, he did, Matthias said in soft amazement. Damn, I've got omelettes and oatmeal on the stove, but find out his name. He disappeared around the cabinets again. Yeah, what is your name? Matthias probed, turning the camera back to the merman, zooming in on his face. Tino. This word came out at once, with no stuttering or effort, the sweet voice speaking it with familiarity. Tino, that's such a cute name, Matthias said. It fits you just right, and I bet you want to know our names too, huh? We've shouted them at each other enough since we found him. He probably already knows, Emil muttered. Oh, come on, that's not true. Tino nodded his head vigorously, and pointed his head at Matthias. Matthias! The young man nearly dropped the camera in surprise, but he managed to keep it focused on Tino as he pointed to Emil next. Emil! He then turned a sunny smile on the big man beside him. Berwald? You can just call him Bear for short like we do if you want, Matthias offered, and Tino seemed to take that idea, nodding decisively. He's been paying attention, all right, Lucas called from the kitchen. Tino sat up straighter and pointed toward the sound of his voice. Lucas. Right, Matthias cheered. Wow, do we really say each other's names that much? Tino nodded, smiling. Don't just nod, Emil said. Try to speak as much as you can so you can practice, all right? All right, Tino said, a bit more confidently. How come you falter in your words like that? Emil asked. Tino concentrated, obviously struggling hard to speak as he explained. My people to talk in our minds can't speak under water. Hold that thought, Matthias said suddenly, and placed the camera down onto the table, facing toward Tino. He dashed over to the sofa in the great room where the tripod was set up and snatched it. With a swiftness born of great practice, he placed the camera on it at an angle wide enough to capture the entire table and the comings and goings around it, then sat himself down on the other side of Bervold at the end of the table. Okay, he said excitedly. This is amazing! Are you telling me that you communicate at the speed of thought? Through your freaking minds? Yes, we hear each other in our minds, so it's hard to speak. Wicked frickin' sweet. Incredible, came Lucas's voice from the kitchen, his head once more peeking out from around the cabinets. Tino looked down a little shyly as they all gazed at him in wonder. Can you do it to us? Emil asked, a little excitement in his voice. Can you speak to us through your head? Tino shook his head. Then, seeing Emil encourage him to speak the answer, said, No. Tried a lot last night. We must be too dim-witted for such a miracle as telepathy, Lucas called. But wait, how could that be how you heard him in the first place? Matthias demanded. You said that you heard someone crying out for help while you were driving before you saw him. Tino looked in Lucas's direction brightly, asking in a stumbling tone, Did you hear me? Lucas didn't answer right away. When he did, he sounded cautious. To be honest, it happened so quickly that it's hard for me to remember. I can't say whether it was really a voice I heard so much as this overwhelming feeling that someone was calling out for help. It blindsided me with how powerful it was. I can't really describe it now, though. Tino chirped happily, nodding his head. So, what about when your people go to the surface? Emil asked. Do you talk to each other out loud then? Too much trouble, Tino stammered slowly. And we don't often. Bervold shifted in his seat and cleared his throat as he said, Well, you're doing very well for your first time speaking. The blonde merman inclined his head to look at Bervold with a smile. It's not easy. Takes forever. Practice makes perfect, Matthias encouraged. But don't push yourself too hard if it's stressful or exhausting, Lucas said. Yeah, just take your time, Emil agreed. We want to listen to you and hear everything you have to say. That's why the camera's been rolling almost since we found you, Matthias said, grinning. You're already an internet star. A look of utter confusion knit Tino's brows together, and he looked at Matthias with his lips parted as though to ask a question, but didn't know where to start. The tall hyperman never did need much of an invitation to begin rambling about what he did. This was no exception. Okay, so we put the video of your rescue last night on the internet, and it's already gotten a ridiculous amount of views. The comment section is blowing up, and already people are clamoring for more of you. Lay off the tech talk for now, Matthias, Bervold suggested, gesturing toward the tripod. He doesn't even know what the camera is doing. Tino glanced from Bervold to Matthias, then to the camera, that was set up a few yards away. He pointed to it and asked slowly, Your pet? Matthias broke out laughing, and Emil joined him. From the kitchen, they heard a small chuckle. No, Tino, Emil said, his voice strained with the need to laugh. We'll explain later. For now, let's just say it's keeping track of everything that we're doing and saying. Don't ask how. It would be too much to explain. Tino gave the camera a suspicious glance before he took a deep breath. He swallowed and lifted his hands before him, forming a cup with them, and bowing his head toward it. The gesture seemed oddly ritualistic, and he remained with his head bowed as he struggled through his next sentence. Thank you. I was lost, and you found me. I am in your depth. My guardians. You're very welcome, came Lucas's voice as the man stepped around the corner. We're glad to be helping you. Now, I could use some help carrying all this out. Emil? The teen sighed, slumping in his chair. Why is it always me? He complained. Because he's your big brother, Matthias answered. You have to do what he tells you. Emil snorted and went to help Lucas in the kitchen. The sounds of clinking came as they began to gather up the breakfast items. It took them a few trips, as there was a lot for so many of them. Emil brought out the few breads they had, along with the butter, jams, and cheeses. Lucas set out the plate of cold-cut meat and vegetables, along with a tube of roe that Bervold insisted on. Emil was also careful to place the potholders strategically along the spots on the table for Lucas to rest the 2 hot dishes. "Your... family?" Tino asked, watching them come and go. Matthias jumped on the question with glee. "Lucas and Emil are brothers. Bervold kind of like an adopted brother. He's the big muscle around here, but we like the guy even if he's not related to us." "Ah, then you? Well, I'm Lucas's true love, of course." Matthias caught Lucas's waist as he was walking by, and hugged him close, rubbing his cheek on the man's side. "I'm carrying oatmeal here, Matthias," Lucas said dismissively. He held a huge steaming pot of oatmeal and had to nudge Matthias with his hip until the man let go, pouting. "You're no fun, babe. Do you want me to spill piping hot porridge on you?" Lucas asked, placing the pot on the table. Matthias gave a wicked smile. "Only if you'll eat it off me afterward." Emil let out a groan and slapped a hand over his face. "I did not need that image," he said in a long, suffering tone. "Yes, please, Matthias. Not in front of my teenage sibling," Lucas said firmly, giving Matthias a smack to the back of his head as he headed toward the kitchen again. "It's nothing I haven't endured hearing before, I guess," Emil mumbled, fiddling with his silverware. Tina was watching the entire scene intently, and suddenly making a humming sound of confirmation. Looking toward Matthias, he said, "So, you're his wife?" Another clatter came from the kitchen, this time very loud, like Lucas had dropped the lid to a pan. Following it was a sound suspiciously like a snort of laughter. Matthias's jaw dropped open as he sat there, speechless for once. Bervold gave a coughing sound reminiscent of a chortle, and Emil flat-out giggled, covering his mouth to try and muffle the sound. Little squeaks came out regardless. Tino's face fell as he saw the various reactions. "No?" he inquired slowly. Matthias opened and closed his mouth a few times before Lucas came to his rescue, carrying out a large pan filled to the brim with salmon omelettes. "Tino, I know where and why you came up with that word, but lover would be a more accurate term." "Oh," Tino said, nodding in understanding. "I'm sorry." "Yeah, besides," Matthias blurted, "we take turns." Lucas dropped the pan loudly onto the potholders on the table, turned, and outright clocked Matthias over the head with a wooden serving spoon.